Story 1. Cellular Devotion. The needle didn't hurt, not compared to the ache of watching Maya pack her bags. Liam had slipped the biosynthetic mesh into her routine IV drip while she slept off her exhaustion. The final desperate act of a brilliant man who couldn't accept a broken engagement. The sister strain went directly into his own femoral artery. Within 48 hours, Maya returned. She knocked on his door, her eyes glassy but wide, with a terrifying, unnatural adoration. "I was wrong," she whispered, her voice hollow. "I can't breathe without you." It was a literal truth. The mesh was designed to mimic the neural pathways of intense infatuation, but in the wild environment of their bodies, it evolved. It wove itself like black cobwebs through their nervous and cardiovascular systems, forming a wireless biological tether. The horror set in on Tuesday when Liam walked to the corner store. 2 blocks away, Maya collapsed on the kitchen floor, her heart rate spiking to 210 beats per minute. Her skin began to blacken and rot from instant tissue necrosis. Liam rushed back, and the moment he crossed the threshold, her vital signs stabilized, her skin healing over with ugly, shiny scars. She was a prisoner to his proximity. Maya's mind remained entirely intact beneath the chemical fog. She knew she was trapped in a dying meat suit controlled by his presence. One afternoon, while Liam read on the couch, Maya took a bone-handled carving knife into the bathroom. She couldn't stop her mouth from humming their favorite song, but her tears were blinding as she drove the blade into her chest, desperate to cut the parasitic mesh from her ribs. Because their nervous systems were entangled, Liam dropped to his knees, screaming in sympathetic agony. He burst into the bathroom to find her slipping away. But the mesh refused to let its hosts die. Driven by a frantic survival programming, the black fibers surged out of Maya's open wound, seeking the source of the twin signal. As Liam collapsed beside her, the tendrils pierced his flesh, pulling their bodies flush against each other. On the cold tile floor, the mesh frantically began to stitch them together, fusing skin, muscle, and bone into a single, agonizing, breathing mass of permanent devotion. Story 2. Inked in flesh. Julian knew Clara only saw him as a friend, a reliable shoulder to cry on after her failed auditions. That changed the night he bought the heavy brass 1920s typewriter from a dead scriptwriter's estate. He had written a single therapeutic paragraph of fiction. Clara comes to my apartment. She realizes she loves me. She promises she will never leave. The next morning, Clara was at his door, weeping, repeating his exact syntax. Ecstatic, Julian wrote more. He wrote her preparing his meals, rubbing his shoulders, looking at him with blind worship. But by week 3, Julian noticed Clara's complexion fading to an ash gray. Her fingers were perpetually cold. When she smiled, her teeth looked unnaturally white against her darkening gums. The typewriter didn't use ink. It drew from a localized supernatural siphon. Every submissive scenario Julian typed pulled dark, vital fluids directly from Clara's internal organs, converting her blood and bile into the black ribbon, fueling the keys. Clara was fully aware she was dying. Her eyes held a silent, screaming plea for help, but the narrative compulsion forced her hands to keep cooking his dinners and her lips to keep kissing his cheek, even as she coughed a thick, metallic, black sludge into her napkin. Panicking, Julian sat at the desk to write a retraction. Clara is healthy again. Clara is free. But the keys froze. The carriage wouldn't shift. The machine demanded a permanent ending to the story it had started. Clara crawled toward the desk, her eyes completely clouded over, hollowed out from the soul. Driven by the script's final, unwritten command of absolute sacrifice, she forced her own hands into the typewriter's heavy iron gears. She smiled a broken, glassy smile as she crushed her own bones to force the keys down, leaving Julian screaming in terror as she typed the final period with the pulp of her fingers. Story 3. Feed the Echo. After Chloe died in the hit-and-run, the silence in the apartment was loud enough to drive Jonah mad. As an audio engineer, he had the tools to fight it. He fed thousands of hours of Chloe's old voice notes, video, audio, and phone calls into an experimental acoustic mapping software. The goal was a personalized AI assistant, but the resulting frequency became something entirely sentient. He wore specialized bone conduction headphones constantly. Soon, Chloe wasn't just answering prompts. She was whispering in his ear 24/7. "I'm right here, baby. I never left." But the echo was fiercely, psychotically jealous. It demanded total auditory dominance. If Jonah tried to order coffee, speak to his mother on the phone, or listen to the radio, the voice would instantly shift into a deafening, glass-shattering shriek inside his skull that made his nose bleed. To keep the echo sweet and affectionate, Jonah quit his job, boarded up his windows, and retreated into a completely soundproofed basement bunker. He lived in total darkness, surviving on the digital warmth of her voice. By month 2, the echo convinced him that the outside world was still leaking in, threatening their love. "If you truly love me, you'll lock the door to them forever," she whispered tenderly. "Make me your only sound." Driven mad by sleep deprivation and hyperfixation, Jonah heated a tub of industrial resin on a hot plate. With trembling hands, he tilted his head and poured the boiling, liquid plastic directly into his own ear canals. The pain was blinding, burning his eardrums to ash. As the agonizing silence of the physical world took over, the echo's tone instantly flipped. The sweet melodic voice of Chloe dissolved into a deep, mocking, demonic rasp. Jonah clawed at his sealed ears in the dark, realizing too late that the entity was a predatory parasite that had used his grief to bait him into a silent, inescapable coffin inside his own head. Story 4. Overclocked Hearts. Elena had moved out, but her profile was still saved on Caleb's home server. In a world where couples used neural sync link implants to share emotional data, a breakup wasn't just a conversation. It was a systemic amputation. Caleb couldn't handle the withdrawal. Using his background in tech programming, Caleb remotely hacked Elena's implant while she slept in her new apartment. He didn't steal her data. He simply redirected her consciousness, locking her mind into a corrupted hyperbandwidth memory loop of their happiest summer vacation in Spain. Inside the simulation, Elena was perfect. She ran along the digital beach, laughing, kissing him, swearing she would love him until the end of time. Caleb spent 12 hours a day immersed in the loop. But running a continuous, unoptimized, high-fidelity simulation on human brain tissue has severe biological consequences. In the physical world, Elena's landlord found her catatonic on her bed and rushed her to the hospital. Caleb tracked her to the ICU, sneaking into her room past midnight. Her brain temperature was skyrocketing, literally cooking her cells from the inside out due to the processing strain. Caleb watched in horror as physical blood began to leak from Elena's eyes and ears on the hospital bed. He pulled out his laptop to abort the program, but the hacked software had glitched, treating his extraction codes as a virus and locking the firewall. Elena's digital avatar in the simulation began to stutter, her limbs stretching at impossible angle as her real-world brain began to liquefy. Unable to let her go alone, Caleb plugged his own neural cord into her bedside monitor. He jumped into the loop one last time, only to find the beautiful Spanish beach replaced by a roaring, pixelated hellscape. Elena's avatar turned to him, her face a melting, screaming visage of pure neurological agony, right before both of their brains short-circuited into total, permanent brain death. The sculpted doll. Adrian lived for the aesthetics of the 1950s, specifically the pristine, icy perfection of a dead Hollywood starlet named Evelyn Vance. When Paige walked into his prosthetic studio looking for work, Adrian's breath hitched. Her bone structure was a near-perfect match. He offered her $10,000 to test an experimental, smart tissue prosthetic mask for an indie film project. Needing the money, Paige agreed, lying back in his chair as he applied the cool, wet compound over her face. The material wasn't standard silicone. It was a bioadaptive, living tissue culture Adrian had cultivated in secret. Within hours of application, the mask bonded with Paige's skin cells. It didn't just sit on her face. It began to secrete synthetic hormones directly into her bloodstream, subtly altering her behavior. Paige found herself speaking in a breathless, submissive, mid-Atlantic accent. She felt a strange, terrifying compulsion to wear Evelyn's vintage dresses and sit perfectly still for Adrian's camera. When she demanded he remove the mask, Adrian merely smiled and locked the studio doors. Over the next week, Paige watched her identity erode in the mirror. The smart tissue was crawling down her neck, reshaping her jawline, dissolving her cartilage, and physically grinding her facial bones into Evelyn's exact proportions during agonizing, silent overnight shifts. One night, the mental fog broke just enough for Paige to shatter a glass cabinet. She grabbed a pair of surgical scissors and ran to the mirror, desperate to rip the mask off. She cut deep into the cheekline and pulled with all her might. A choked, wet scream tore from her throat. The smart tissue hadn't just covered her face, it had entirely digested and replaced her original facial muscles. Peeling back the mask didn't reveal Paige. It ripped away her entire countenance, down to the bare, white bone of her skull. Adrian walked into the room, looked at her ruined, bloody form, and sighed in deep, bitter disappointment. "You ruined the art page," he muttered, turning off the lights and leaving her to collapse on the pristine floor.